Abigail Adams even learned French this way outside of school.
Sounds like they were book maxing.
Yes, they were
Wh-
book maxing and letter maxing.
You've reached American History Hotline. You ask the questions, we get the answers. Leave a message.
Hey there, American History Hotliners. Bob Crawford here. Thrilled to be joining you again for another episode of American History Hotline. It's the show where you ask the questions. And the best way to get us a question is on our website, our new website. That's AmericanHistoryHotline.com. That's AmericanHistoryHotline.com. Okay, here's today's question. It's from Jen in Auburn, California. She writes, I've been homeschooling my two small children, 7 and 10, and I feel like some of my family thinks it's weird. Like my children aren't being socialized, but my kids have a lot of friends, and I feel like homeschooling was the norm until modern history. My question is, what is the history of schools and education in America? Are public schools a relatively new phenomenon? Jen, that is a great question. I too have friends who homeschool their kids. My kids go to school, but I'm not really sure what the studies show as far as socialization and homeschooling. And I'm really not familiar with the history of public schooling in America. So I am excited to have the perfect guest to talk about all of this. She is Dixie Dillon Lane, a historian and author of the book Skipping School, A History of American Homeschooling and How It Went Mainstream. Dixie, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Dixie, your book is about homeschool, and I want to get to homeschooling. But let's start with schooling in general. If we go back 250 years, would kids be going to public schools like most do today?
That's a wonderful question. I think that the 18th century, around the time of the American Revolution, feels very, very far away to us. And a lot of things were really different about it. And one of the things that was different was that even though Americans, right from the beginning, right from the 17th century, really believed in education, really believed in literacy, they didn't necessarily think of education as school. So America had public schools right from the beginning, but it also had fee-paying schools, different kinds of private schools, and it had very commonly all sorts of different forms of home education.
Dixie, you use the example of Abigail Adams as an example in a recent article you wrote. What was her experience with education in America as a girl in the 1700s?
Abigail Adams is a great example of early American education. She was born in 1744 in Massachusetts. Her father was a pastor, so they were relatively well off. And her life is an example of all the different kinds of education that were available. So schooling was quite common at that time, but learning outside of school was also very common. Because Abigail was a girl, she was a little bit less likely to go to school. And in the end, her parents had some concerns about her health and they kept her home. But she was able to study on her own. She was able to study with the help of her grandmother, and she was able to study with the help of her friends. One of the most interesting things I learned recently when I was reading a biography of Adams was that her peer culture actually supported education as an activity that they would do together, reading books together, exchanging letters about books, talking about things. And Abigail Adams even learned French this way outside of school.
Sounds like they were book maxing.
Yes, they were book maxing and letter maxing.
Well, they were definitely those New Englanders, those Puritans. They were some letter maxers for sure.
Mm-hmm.
When did the idea of public schooling start to catch on?
Well, the first public school in what would later become the United States was in the 17th century. It was very early.
So it's like, I mean, literally, as the nation is being established or as the colonies are being established, schooling is just a part of life.
And it's always been important to Americans. In the 19th century, as the frontier was being developed, by white Americans. Often it was required for a town, when a town was chartered, to have a spot set aside for a school, for example. But what's different about those centuries far in the past and the present day is that at the time it was not Americans did not equate school and education. So it was just as ordinary to not go to school and still become educated as it was to be educated through school.
We've talked about this a little bit on the show. In the late 1800s, schools were places where immigrant children were Americanized. Uh, what was the goal? Like, you talk about it's education, but it's not necessarily it's not, schools aren't necessarily solely for education, and you don't need schools to become educated, seems to be the attitude. What was the main driver then to send your children to school versus to not to educate them at home back then?
Well, right before the Civil War, so right in the middle of the 19th century, there was a new idea called the common school that started to take hold. And the idea was that communities would have a public school that was held in common. Because even before this, even though there were public schools, it was also really common to go to a fee-paying school, just a private school of some sort. And the common school was designed not just to educate children, but to bring children from different socioeconomic classes together and form them as citizens of a single nation.
Okay, can I dig in on this a little bit?
Yeah,
Okay, so where did this start in a certain part of the country, or was this seemed to be in the national firmament?
it was popularized by a man named Horace Mann. And it was something that, was taken up all over the country, less in the American South at that period as in the North. But then it sort of morphed into this foundation for what happened in cities during immigration and urbanization, as you're talking about in the late 19th century, that we started to think of school a little bit less as just a way of learning literacy and numeracy and some civics, and much more as a social project of the community and of the government to manage the differences within society. So you have all sorts of children in these schools in New York City, and you know, urban life was not the norm in the United States. It began to become the norm around that time. And people did not know how to handle the sheer mass of humanity that was packing into these cities. And one of the things that started to happen across the turn of the century was that the old ways of educating weren't working so well either, because children were no longer growing up on family farms and they just were not in the same context. So they weren't learning things the same way.
You're making me think about, or you're reminding me of reading about William Henry Seward in the 1840s. He's the governor of New York,
Mm-hmm.
and he is working, trying to get public funding for Catholic schools in New
Mm-hmm.
York City. So,
Mm-hmm.
when did schools begin to get public funding?
Well, public schools started having public funding right from the
But
beginning.
yeah, I mean, like from
Yeah,
I mean that came from taxpayers and the government
right.
and all of that.
Oh, well, money is so tied up in education in our country.
Mm,
And I think, these days, when we think about schools, public schools in our country, we think of it almost like it's a national system. It's actually not a national system, it's a
right.
system of systems, right? But we think of it in more national terms. That was not the way it was through most of history. People thought of their public schools very locally, and they were under a lot of local control. And you mentioned Seward in the 1840s and trying to figure out, the country was trying to figure out in the 19th century whether a Catholic school or any kind of religious
Hmm.
school could be funded by the government, for example. It wasn't settled. It didn't feel settled. Um, but in the 20th century, there were other forces that got the federal government involved in funding education. They were not religious forces. And that really, really changed how schools were conceived of in our country.
Well, I want to remind everybody here that we're going to get into homeschooling, but I just want to set the table so we have an understanding of the big picture here. So I'm glad you mentioned the 20th century. Uh, talk about that. What were those forces that you were speaking of?
So it may seem to folks out there like we're sort of jumping from century to century, but actually what we're talking about is a couple of different threads. There's not one thread of American education across history. There's two or three, and different little subthreads in different kinds. And one thread is the story of schools becoming consolidated, coming more and more under government control and expert control, and eventually more and more under national control rather than just your neighborhood. And the 20th century is when that really happened, especially after the Cold War. So schools in the early 20th century, compulsory education was on the books in every state by the early 20th century. And then in the Great Depression, as there were fewer and fewer jobs available for teenagers because adults were taking the jobs teenagers would have had, and the federal government and local government started providing food for children at schools, high school attendance just skyrocketed.
And
So all
is
these
this
kids started
because
going
of
to school
food? Is this because of
because of
food?
food and because they couldn't get work. So children who even in the 20s, teenagers, 15-year-olds who might have gone and gotten a job, you know, they didn't do that as much in the 30s because the jobs they used to have, they were going to grown men. They were going to grown men. So the sort of the equivalent of flipping burgers, it was now fathers of families who were flipping burgers. And these kids could go to school and they could get a hot meal. That was the beginning of the school lunch program.
I have to ask you. I had a question here, and I was just decided not to ask it. But now that you bring this up, we did an episode about the Newsies,
Uh-huh.
who were
Yeah.
these kids who sold newspapers and they worked in factories, and you know, kids that would go to school, get in trouble. Like talk about that. Like that battle over like kids that didn't go to school and
Yeah.
got in trouble and working in factories, and because you're talking early 20th century here.
Yeah. Okay. So before this period, there was this sort of general idea that children should be literate, children should get some schooling. But what that meant was very vague, and it was up to parents. It was up to parents, really, and to some degree to the kids themselves. But then as you get toward the 20th century, we have these high urban populations. We don't know how to manage them with sanitation. We don't know how to feed that number of people. It's a big demographic change and a change in the way of life. And that was the beginning of the progressive movement, which was, the beginning of government social welfare in our country. And it was people who were trying to solve these problems and help people who were really suffering. And one of the things that happened was stronger child labor laws, which I think we can all agree were a good thing to prevent children from having to work
Most
in
of us
coal
can. Most
mines.
of us can.
Most of us can, for 14 or 15 hours a day. I mean, we have music about this stuff. There's still
Mhm.
children's songs about going down and washing the coal. My kids listen to them, probably because I'm a history nerd. But your kids can too, anyone listening. But the point is, a bunch of things came together to make school just much more important in children's lives. So compulsory education, child labor laws, in the Depression, the availability of food and the lack of work. And then getting into the 1940s, just the beginning of a much stronger teen culture. Rather than children and teens participating in the wider culture, we started to see the development of a separate economic and social teen culture. If you think of the 1950s, you know exactly what I'm talking about,
Absolutely. Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Um, but
Is this a
yeah.
result of World War II and the burgeoning middle class post World War II?
Yeah, I think in part. I mean, I think that teenagers had a little bit more of a role economically during World War II than they might have had during the Depression, just because they couldn't get work during the Depression. Um, but also, America had had a really tough 15 years from the stock market
Mhm.
crash up to the end of the Second World War. And the Second World War, really boosted the American economy. And as consumerism became more prevalent in the nation, it was discovered that teenagers made excellent consumers. They could get little jobs, but they were still in school. They didn't have the responsibility of adults. They would have disposable income. And it also was just a little bit of a social revolution. The way that we had socialized teenagers in the past was in, mixed age groups and workplaces and families. And now teenagers were being socialized in high schools. So it was really quite different.
When did the idea of a national curriculum or national curriculum standards come into
Mhm.
play?
Well, it's quite recent, really, with the Common Core. However, it began in the 1950s. So in 1957, when the USSR launched Sputnik, a satellite, the United States government started to become aware that education was important for national defense. So previously, education had been thought of as important for other reasons, some of which we've outlined, but there was not a reason for the federal government to be paying particular attention to education. And after the space race really got going during the Cold War, the federal government started to pour money into research and development in STEM, in order to be able to keep up in the space race and the arms race. And again, that was a matter of national defense. But in order to have researchers doing that, you need to have kids. You need to have kids who are prepared to become those researchers. So federal money started to trickle down, and also just federal oversight into lower schools as well. And with federal money and federal concern for education comes centralization.
This is American History Hotline. I'm your host, Bob Crawford. Today, my guest is Dixie Dillon Lane, author of the book Skipping School, A History of American Homeschooling and How It Went Mainstream. We're taking you back to school here on American History Hotline. And if you want to help us brandish our education, send us your questions about American history. You can do that by sending a question, post a video of yourself asking the question maybe, or use the voice memo app on your phone and send your question to our website, americanhistoryhotline.com. Now back to the show. Let's talk about the movie Mean Girls. You use that as an example in your book to show how people viewed homeschooled kids around the turn of the millennium. How did the homeschooled character Katie fare in public school?
Well, Mean Girls is just a fascinating, wonderful, enjoyable movie. I was talking with my brother about it the other day, and he said that was basically just a documentary of our high school experience. I think a lot of people recognize things in it, even though it's all hyperbole. So Katie is homeschooled. She's been homeschooled all her life in Africa because her parents are anthropologists or something. I don't know, zoologists. And then she comes to this high school north of Chicago, and she just gets thrown into public school. And the story of the movie, if you're not familiar with it, is about how she comes in sort of innocent and she tries to infiltrate the popular girls so she can overthrow them. But instead, she's tempted to become a mean girl just like them. So I wanted to frame my book using this story because there was a movie made in 2004 and then another movie, a remake, in 2024. And one of the fascinating things about it is that it not only tells us in an exaggerated way about the high school experience in the United States at those two times, but it tells us what people thought about homeschooling. So when Katie comes in the first movie, there are these jokes about stereotypes of homeschoolers, that they're really backward or they win spelling bees. And then she explains that that's not really how she is. She's well-adjusted, she's kind, she had friends back home. Her teacher's really surprised at how good at math she is. And I use that sort of as an entryway because at the turn of the millennium, homeschooling was something that was sort of on the edge of change. It was no longer something that people weren't aware of, but it also was something that was no longer quite as weird as the stereotypes suggested.
Since COVID, we're in a pretty fragmented would you agree that since COVID, we're in a fragmented educational system? There are public and private schools, charter schools, magnet schools, and more people are homeschooling. Uh, you homeschool your children. Why did you make that decision?
Why did I decide to homeschool my
Yeah.
children?
Well, and
Yeah.
it doesn't have to. It can be personal, but it can also be in the context of the landscape of
Yeah.
because it is a landscape, right?
It's
Like,
it's a great word.
yeah, because I
Yeah.
have a special needs child, and
Mhm.
for her, the only game in town is public school.
Mhm.
And you talk about the way the resources are, like how it's how education, public schools are many systems, and how those resources flow, and the kids that go to public school versus very popular here in North Carolina, and the state legislature has gone a long way to promote charter schools. So, what made you choose homeschooling?
Well, I love the word you use, landscape, and it's a
Mm.
word I use a lot in my book, that we have an educational landscape. And one of the things about this explosion of educational experimentation since COVID is that it's not that it's fragmented education, it's that it's shown us that education was not really as systematized as we thought. That Americans don't actually only think of education as top-down, policy-driven public school systems. We still have, I talked about threads a little earlier, we still are holding on not just to the thread of centralization, but to the thread of local and even parental control of education that Abigail Adams demonstrates. So when you're looking at your school options, I think for a while in the 20th century, people didn't think a lot about schooling in terms of options. Most people would reflexively send their children to a public school, or if they were in a certain economic class, to a private school, or if they were of a certain religion, to, for example, the Catholic parochial school system, right? Well, today, we actually have more children being homeschooled than attend Catholic parochial schools. It's almost double, in fact. So I think that today parents are beginning more to think about schooling in terms of choices. And that was the case for me and for my husband. Our eldest daughter is just finished ninth grade. So this was a dozen years ago that we were making this decision. But it was less an ideological one, less a reflexive one,
Mhm.
even, and more that we looked at the public schools where we lived. We talked with our pediatrician. We talked with other parents. We looked at the test scores. Um, and we looked at the private school options, which, like most Americans, we couldn't afford,
Mhm.
at that time. And so homeschooling was what we chose. There were other reasons too, pedagogical ones, but in my research, I found that while there are still certainly people who homeschool because it's a very strong part of their subculture, for example, their religious denomination, and they think that's the only way to do it, most parents aren't homeschooling like that anymore. Most parents who homeschool are doing so from a variety of reasons, many of which are pragmatic, and informed by their own experience.
Can we look at COVID as being a break point?
Yes. Yes.
Talk about that.
So homeschooling has grown consistently since its resurgence in the second half of the 20th century. And it's become increasingly more public as it was established as legal in all 50 states. And it's become increasingly more diverse. However, when the school lockdowns hit, and if you'll recall, virtually all the states established either mandatory or optional school lockdowns. There were maybe, I don't remember how many, but it was less than 10 states that did not, I think. And that's in my book, that particular statistic. Most of these children started experiencing Zoom schooling. And as parents will remember, this was really challenging. And it was challenging for
It
many
was a
different
nightmare.
reasons.
It was a
It was
nightmare.
challenging for many different reasons. And one thing that happened was that parents started to observe what their children were learning and how, in a way that they weren't observing before. And a lot of parents wanted something different or better. For some people, they made a sort of philosophical turn. I don't think what my kid is learning is actually good, or I'm realizing my kid doesn't really know how to read. And for some parents, it was more of a temporary thing. Like I have a relative who it just seemed so inhumane to keep her young kids in front of a screen for that many hours a day, and so impossible as a parent that, she decided, what, we're just going to quietly do something different until this changes.
You mentioned that homeschooling became legal in all 50 states. Was it ever illegal?
Who knows? I mean, there wasn't legislation about homeschooling
Okay.
because as legislation developed in the 20th century about schooling and the education codes were established in the late 19th and 20th centuries, that was about codifying schools. So it wasn't really talking about homeschools. And so this had to be adjudicated through the courts. But one of the problems was early on in the 70s, 80s, even the 90s, was that because no one was completely sure whether homeschooling was legal in any particular state, and you got to remember the codes of education are by state, they're not national.
Right.
There was a lot of risk because even if you were going to win a court battle, you didn't want to get into one. You didn't want to have somebody call the truant officer on you, so early homeschooling was a very hidden activity, which also makes it really hard to study. um, but today it's a much, much more public one. That doesn't mean that all the law around homeschooling is firmly established. There are always things that are changing, but it is illegal. I mean, it is legal with different regulations or no regulations depending on the state.
The move to charter schools is being supported in a lot of states by the state legislature. Often it's Republican. The Republican Party supports the decentralization, the deregulate, however you want to put it. There is a political bent towards the legislative side and the funding side of public schools. And so people are being given vouchers to pay to go to charter school rather than go to the public school. And that leaves the people who don't have a choice but to go to the public school. Special needs is the main one because I live it. And then some people who don't make a lot of money can't afford, often minorities, right?
Mhm.
So talk about that for a second. Talk about the funding side of the public school debate, public charter, public private debate, and do you see what's the future of public schools if they're being seem to be systematically being defunded in a lot of areas?
I'm glad you bring up special needs and also access because justice is an important factor in education. And in justice, every child in our country deserves a safe and at least adequate academic education. That is a child's right, and it's a matter of justice. And at times, that question has, I think, rightly justified intervention from experts or outsiders or higher levels of government. The obvious example being dealing with racial segregation in places where local communities simply were not going to be fair to different kinds of children. So we have that. That also, however, creates a force that prioritizes public schooling and prioritizes high-level control of public schooling regardless of public school performance. And that's a justice issue too. So I think when we're talking about programs that take money away from public schools, so if you have a public school that's being funded based on attendance, and then the legislation in that state passes a voucher or an ESA program where the money is taken from that school and given to a private school, for example, or given directly to homeschool parents, that takes funding away from a school that needs it. And as you're saying, there are plenty of kids who have to go to public schools. The problem here is, first of all, that funding does not directly correlate to performance. So we've seen funding go up and up and up in public schools, and we have seen performance go down and down and down. So funding is important. We have to fund our schools, but it's not the case that it's the only, it's not really clear how much it matters and in what way it matters to school performance.
Well, I can tell you from personal experience. It's children who have seizure disorders, children who are in wheelchairs, like my child, children who are severely autistic, children who they are often lumped into one classroom together, and there's not enough. The school can't afford to hire the support for that classroom, and the people who are giving medicines and being an aide, they're making less than you would make at Dick's Sporting Goods with no benefits. And so it does seem like, you can say, well, funding has gone up and gone up and gone up, but the public school teachers aren't making what their profession probably demands. Right. And so when you're literally taking from the least of these, when you defund the school and you're taking away from special needs, which I learned this year, DEI, special needs is part of DEI. And so now you have in the federal level, the shuttering of the Department of Education ultimately is the goal here. And so we've lost a lot of funding there, and they want to cut DEI programs. Well, there's a lot of different ways to quantify or define DEI. One way is inclusion, which is special needs. So, and then the charter schools who are receiving a boost in funding on the state level, and here in North Carolina in particular, they don't offer programs for special needs kids or severely autistic kids. They don't provide the physical therapy that they need, or the speech therapy, or the visual therapy. And so it does seem like we have a problem. There's a problem here. It's a problem of priorities. And I don't know how everybody gets what they need.
I completely agree with you. And I think it's a problem that feels unsolvable. Now, I know it's not unsolvable, but, as you're speaking about all these different elements in public education and places where funding is needed, and we know that funding isn't directly tied to performance. We also know that funds are mismanaged, and yet we also have to fund the care and education of our children, especially those who are the neediest and who need an excellent care and education the most, as opposed to just what might be considered even adequate. So I agree with you about that. And I would add that homeschooling families often use public school services for special needs children. These things, even homeschooling and schools, are intertwined. These are not groups that should be enemies, in my opinion. However, I would say that I don't feel strongly that vouchers should be off the table. Now, I don't really have a political opinion on this, but I think that, I remember talk about school vouchers when I was in school in the 80s and the 90s. And one of the common arguments against it was that it was essentially a Band-Aid, and that it might help the kids who were pulled out and were put into private school with vouchers, but that it would leave all the other kids behind because kids with highly motivated parents would now be pulled out. Right. So the idea was the public schools would just get worse and worse. Unfortunately, they've gotten worse and worse anyway. So I think the motivation behind parents who want to use vouchers is more similar to a parent who's trying to get funding for a program at the public school, is my own child needs an education. and I care about other children, but my own child should not be the collateral damage either. So this is the mess that we're in with public education, is that we can't seem to figure out how to get the resources that are needed to the people who need them and will do a good job with them. And I think it can be extremely frustrating for parents and also for teachers and administrators who are trying to help kids and hit all sorts of roadblocks in their work.
One interesting part of your research and your work is identifying that more people are doing homeschooling, and one of that surprised me to learn one of the biggest demographic groups doing this are Black families. They're choosing to homeschool their children. Talk about why and how long has this trend been going on in the Black community?
I was actually absolutely shocked to find that so many African American families were homeschooling. There have always been people of color who have homeschooled, but predominantly it was a white phenomenon for most of the 20th century. I was so glad to be able to talk in depth with some African American families for my research who had been homeschooling since the 1980s. So I do go in depth into that in the book. But, you know, in the pandemic, the number of African American homeschoolers, I think it almost quintupled. I mean, it went up so dramatically between the spring of 2020 and the fall of 2020. And what you might remember from those years racially in our country was um, a lot of racial strife and a lot of people feeling that, you know, racial inequity was a big part of the trouble that we were experiencing during the COVID lockdowns and that people were not being treated fairly. It sort of exacerbated those tensions. And African American families, like other families, looked at what was happening with the schooling in that context, and a lot of them wanted more control over what their children were learning, not just academically, but also in terms of how people of their race were being portrayed and how history and literature and testing was being done in those schools. So there was a huge explosion of homeschool curricula that was from a more racially diverse perspective, for example, and those things were just selling out like crazy during 2020 and 2021.
How do universities look at homeschool? An applicant who was homeschooled versus an applicant who went through a public school system or charter school or some more formal school system.
Yeah, I mean, they used to have no idea what to do with them. I mean, I grew up in California, and the University of California used to have to make sort of a special case for yourself if you were applying there and you were homeschooled. Now they have a whole system for applying homeschoolers. Yeah, but different colleges and universities look at them differently. But you know, basically, you just have to have a formal transcript. You have to take the SAT or the ACT or the CLT, and you're good to apply.
The numbers don't lie. When they get the results of the test, if someone, it doesn't matter where you were schooled, if you're scoring in a certain range, your numbers don't lie.
Yeah, and there's a lot of diversity among homeschoolers in terms of how well academically prepared they are for college, but we do know that they do tend to score on average significantly above public schoolers on things like the ACT. Um, and so, there's some self-selection in there too, but what it does tell us in part is that homeschoolers are not on average academically poorly served by homeschooling, whether that doesn't tell us anything about them in relation to public if they had been in public school, but it does tell us that they're doing all right.
So I was going to ask you, what do you think the future of education looks like in America? And do you think at some point we're all going to be like Abigail Adams?
I don't think so. I do think that homeschooling has become what I call a minor norm or a minority norm in the educational landscape. When you make that comparison, for example, to Catholic schools, you know, most people don't use Catholic schools. Most people don't think it's weird to go to Catholic school, though. That's something some people do. We all know it. It's, whatever, it's fine. And homeschooling is bigger than that now. And we have homeschoolers from all different demographics. I mean, just not just racially, but religiously, in terms of economic class, income level, education level, where they live in the country, whether they live in cities, suburbs, rural. It's just, it's so demographically similar to the United States at large. So I think one result of the pandemic is really just that a lot of people have remembered that we can try things independently in schooling and that systems aren't the only way to get an education. So I think that there's going to be continued experimentation in education in our country. I also think the governments are going to continue to legislate about this. And I don't know how that kind of regulation is going to affect things. And I also know that public school districts, are trying to get on this bandwagon of homeschooling. And a lot of kids are now being homeschooled through public school programs. So it's all so intertwined. And I think we're just going to have to experiment and play around with give and take to see what we end up with going forward.
I've been talking with Dixie Dillon Lane. She's a historian and author of the book Skipping School, A History of American Homeschooling and How It Went Mainstream. Dixie, thanks for joining us today on American History Hotline.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.